American history is not only shaped by victories, it is also shaped by mistakes. A weak government that almost failed before the country was stable, a court decision that pushed the nation closer to civil war, a farming practice that helped turn the Great Plains into dust, an intelligence failure that left an entire fleet exposed, a financial system that looked safe until it collapsed. These were not small errors. They changed the direction of the country. Some were made by leaders under pressure. Some were made by ordinary people following the logic of their time. Some were made by institutions that had every reason to know better, but in each case, a decision was made, an assumption went unchallenged, a warning was ignored, and the country was never quite the same again. These are the major mistakes that changed American history forever. Number 10, the Articles of Confederation. Before the United States had its Constitution, it had a different governing document. It was called the Articles of Confederation. It was ratified in 1781 during the final years of the Revolutionary War. At the time, it seemed like a reasonable design for a new nation that had just fought a war against a powerful central government. The founders were afraid of giving too much power to any single authority, so they built a government that had almost none. Under the Articles, Congress could not collect taxes. It could not regulate trade between states. It could not force states to cooperate with each other. Each state was effectively its own country. When the federal government needed money to pay its war debts, it could only ask states to contribute. Most refused. The result was near collapse. The Continental Army went unpaid. Inflation destroyed the currency. States imposed tariffs on each other like foreign nations. A rebellion broke out in Massachusetts in 1786, and the federal government was powerless to respond effectively. The mistake was not malicious. It came from a genuine fear of tyranny. But it left the new nation so weak it could barely function. The crisis forced the founders back to the drawing board. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 was called largely because the Articles had failed. Without that failure, the Constitution might never have been written. Number 9, the Missouri Compromise and the question it refused to answer. In 1820, the United States was expanding westward. New states were being added, and with each new state came the same burning question. Would slavery be permitted there or not? Congress brokered a deal. Missouri would enter as a slave state. Maine would enter as a free state. A geographic line would be drawn across the country. Slavery would be prohibited north of that line in future territories. It felt like a solution. It quieted the argument for a generation. Most Americans breathed a sigh of relief and moved on. But the compromise did not resolve anything. It only postponed a confrontation the country was not yet willing to have. It established the precedent that slavery was a political bargaining chip rather than a moral crisis demanding a direct answer. Every deal that followed the same logic. Delay, balance, defer. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 eventually undid the compromise entirely, reopening the wound in a way that could no longer be contained. Historians widely argue that the refusal to address slavery directly in 1820 set the country on a slow path towards civil war. The compromise bought time, but it also made the reckoning, when it finally arrived, far more violent. Number 8, the Dred Scott decision. In 1857, the Supreme Court handed down one of the most consequential rulings in American history. The case involved a man named Dred Scott, an enslaved man who had lived for years in free territories and sued for his freedom on that basis. The court ruled against him, but it went much further than the case required. Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote that Black Americans had no standing to bring a case in federal court at all. He argued they were not citizens. He also ruled that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in any territory. The Missouri Compromise, which had structured the country's expansion for nearly 4 decades, was declared unconstitutional in a single decision. The ruling did not settle the slavery debate, it exploded it. Northerners who had accepted compromise as a necessary evil now saw the legal framework being dismantled. The decision radicalized many moderates. It gave the new Republican Party a surge of support. Abraham Lincoln used the Dred Scott ruling as a central point in his debates with Stephen Douglas. 3 years after the ruling, the country elected Lincoln. Less than a year after that, southern states began to secede. The court had tried to end the argument with a verdict. Instead, it helped ignite a war. Number 7, the rise of Jim Crow and the abandonment of Reconstruction. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the United States had an opportunity to rebuild the South on a foundation of legal equality. For a brief period, it tried. Black men voted and held office. Constitutional amendments guaranteed citizenship and equal protection. Federal troops enforced civil rights in southern states. Then, in 1877, it stopped. A contested presidential election was resolved through a political deal. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South, Republican support for Reconstruction collapsed, southern states were left to govern themselves. And within years, they systematically dismantled the rights that had been won. Jim Crow laws were passed across the South. Black citizens were removed from voter rolls through poll taxes, literacy tests, and violence. Segregation was enforced by law. The Supreme Court upheld it in Plessy v. in 1896. The mistake was the abandonment itself. Reconstruction was not a failure of ideas, it was a failure of follow-through. The political will collapsed before the legal changes could take root. What followed was nearly a century of legally enforced racial inequality. The consequences shaped the country's economy, its politics, and its social divisions in ways that the nation is still reckoning with today. Number 6. The Dust Bowl and the destruction of the Great Plains. In the 1930s, a vast region stretching from Texas to the Dakotas became one of the worst environmental disasters in American history. Millions of acres of fertile soil simply blew away. Entire communities were buried under walls of black dust. Hundreds of thousands of people lost everything and fled west. It was not caused only by drought, it was caused by decisions made over decades. After the Great Plains were settled in the late 1800s, farmers plowed up the native grasses that had held the soil together for thousands of years. The land was planted with wheat. When prices were high, farmers plowed more. When drought came in the early 1930s, there were no root systems to hold the earth in place. The mistake was the assumption that the land was limitless and self-sustaining. Farmers were following the logic of the market and the technology of the time. No one warned them that they were destroying the soil's ability to survive drought. The federal government had actively encouraged westward settlement without understanding the ecological consequences. The Dust Bowl drove one of the largest internal migrations in American history. It deepened the suffering of the Great Depression. It forced the country to develop federal soil conservation programs that had never existed before. And it permanently changed how Americans understood the relationship between agriculture and the environment. Number 5. Pearl Harbor and the failure of intelligence. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Over 2,400 Americans were killed. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed. 8 battleships were damaged or sunk. The United States was pulled into the Second World War. The attack was described as a surprise, but the warning signs had been present. American intelligence agencies had broken Japanese diplomatic codes. Military analysts knew Japan was planning aggressive action in the Pacific. A radar operator on Oahu detected a large formation of aircraft approaching the island more than an hour before the attack and reported it. The report was dismissed. The radar blip was assumed to be American planes arriving from the mainland. The failure was not a lack of information, it was a failure of interpretation and coordination. Different agencies held different pieces of the picture. Assumptions about where Japan would strike filtered out the signals that pointed to Hawaii. The military establishment believed an attack on American soil was unlikely. Pearl Harbor forced the United States into a global war that reshaped the country's role in the world permanently. It led directly to the internment of Japanese Americans, one of the most significant civil liberties violations in modern American history. And it established a lesson, which the country would have to relearn again, that intelligence failures carry catastrophic costs. Number 4. The Vietnam escalation. In 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It gave President Lyndon Johnson broad authority to escalate American military involvement in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. The resolution was based in part on reports of an attack on American ships by North Vietnamese forces in the Gulf of Tonkin. Later investigations revealed the second reported attack almost certainly never happened. But even beyond that incident, the deeper mistake was the assumption underlying American strategy. Military and political leaders believed that escalating force would break North Vietnamese resolve. They believed air power and superior firepower would bring the war to a manageable conclusion. They believed the domino theory, that if Vietnam fell, all of Southeast Asia would follow. Each assumption was wrong. By the time American involvement peaked, over 500,000 troops were in Vietnam. The war cost more than 58,000 American lives. It fractured American society, discredited the government in the eyes of millions, and ended the political careers of those who managed it. The War Powers Act of 1973 was passed specifically to limit presidential war-making power. Trust in American institutions, which had been near its post-war high, began a long decline that has never fully reversed. Number 3. Watergate and the cover-up that changed American politics. In June 1972, operatives connected to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington. The burglary itself was politically motivated and clearly illegal, but Nixon's re-election was never seriously in doubt. He would win 49 of 50 states that November. The crime was serious. The cover-up was catastrophic. Nixon's administration worked to obstruct the FBI investigation. Hush money was paid, evidence was destroyed. When the existence of White House recordings was revealed, Nixon attempted to suppress them. The Saturday Night Massacre, in which the president ordered the firing of the special prosecutor and senior Justice Department officials, resigned rather than comply, shocked the country. Nixon resigned in August 1974, the only American president to do so. The long-term damage was not just to his presidency, it was to American political culture. Public trust in the federal government, which had already been shaken by Vietnam, collapsed further. Cynicism toward government institutions accelerated. The word Watergate became shorthand for political corruption, permanently entering the American vocabulary. Future presidents would face far greater scrutiny, and decades later, that erosion of institutional trust remains one of the defining features of American political life. Number 2, the 2008 financial crisis and the failure of financial oversight. In 2008, the American financial system came closer to total collapse than most people realized at the time. Major banks failed or nearly failed. Credit markets froze. Millions of Americans lost their homes, their jobs, and their retirement savings. The global economy went into freefall. The root of the crisis was years in the making. Through the 1990s and 2000s, financial institutions created complex mortgage-backed securities that bundled home loans together and sold them to investors. The assumption was that housing prices would continue rising. Lending standards were relaxed dramatically. People who could not afford their mortgages were approved for loans. Rating agencies gave risky products high safety ratings. Regulators did not intervene, partly because of a prevailing belief that the financial sector was capable of managing its own risks. The financial instruments were so complex that even the people selling them did not fully understand the exposure they were creating. When housing prices began to fall, the entire structure collapsed simultaneously. The federal government spent hundreds of billions of dollars in bailout funds to prevent a total collapse of the banking system. The recession that followed was the worst since the Great Depression. New regulatory frameworks were created under the Dodd-Frank Act. But the crisis permanently shifted how millions of Americans understood economic security, home ownership, and the relationship between Wall Street and the government. Number 1, the Iraq War and the intelligence failure that reshaped American foreign policy. In March 2003, the United States led an invasion of Iraq. The stated justification was clear: Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. This was not presented as a possibility, it was presented as a certainty. Secretary of State Colin Powell made the case before the United Nations with satellite images, recorded communications, and detailed claims about Iraqi weapons programs. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found. The intelligence was wrong. The assessment process had been shaped, in part, by pressure to confirm a conclusion that had already been reached. Analysts who raised doubts were sidelined. The complexity of the actual evidence was simplified into certainty for public presentation. The consequences were enormous. Nearly 4,500 American troops were killed. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians died in the violence that followed. The removal of Saddam Hussein destabilized the region in ways that planners had not anticipated. The power vacuum contributed to the rise of new extremist groups, including the Islamic